combination of both divine and infinite with the finite and temporal, there is an inevitable moral breakdown, which we should expect. And in Hindu thought and religion, when we consider that all is Brahman and Brahman is all, we thus all bear sparks of the divine. But you would think that would mean that we should not slay one another, that we would not murder one another. Not so. We should, by implication, be indifferent to such an act of great evil, because in the end it is simply sameness acting upon sameness. It is the magic of Brahman being acted upon Brahman. This is why Arjuna is persuaded to be indifferent, because there cannot be an objective moral law. All is meaningless in the being and nature of this impersonal Brahman, because all is relative and subjective. Now, what Arjuna exhibited in the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita is the realization of our human condition, the sin nature that plagues us generation after generation, all because of the first Adam in the biblical narrative. And Arjuna had a basic understanding of good and evil because the personal Creator God had placed the knowledge of this law in our hearts because we were created in God's image. For we read this in Romans chapter 1, verse 32. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. And this is referring to the unbeliever. In fact, New Testament scholar Leon Morris writes that, granted that no evildoer ever understands all the implications of the wrong that he is doing, it still remains that he knows enough to know that he is doing wrong. And it is the point that Paul has been stressing throughout this chapter, namely, that God has revealed enough of himself for people to know what is right and what is wrong. However, in order to remove this notion of morality, an alternative reality must replace the created order of God, an impersonal God that pervades all of reality, where its deity extensions or gods can serve as avatars to guide humanity to this pantheistic worldview where all is indifference and relativism. Now, maybe your minds are clicking right now as to the connection of the Avatar and the film we were watching last night, as to how Cameron was trying to introduce these pagan concepts through film. These are the implications of Hinduism, and the moral breakdown is one of various systematic failures within the Hindu worldview, which render it false and impossible to abide by. So in other words, what we see with the Hindu worldview is an alternate worldview. It's an illusion. It's the lie, because it is trying to absolutely erase created reality. It's trying to erase the truth of God's word and God's law. And what we see in the Bhagavad Gita is, in fact, I would say, an excellent story of what non-believing thought tries to do. Arjuna recognizes some truth of God's creation, some concept of good and evil. He's able to know this. He has this sensation because he's been created in the image of God. And what this unbelieving thought essentially does is erase this knowledge of the truth. It tries to erase it or suppress it by introducing an altogether different reality. Now that's the Hindu worldview, and there's a lot packed into there. Hinduism is quite a vast religion. And really to try to divide its various subsections or subcategories or subgroups would take a very long time. In fact, encyclopedia's worth, just because of how diverse the religion has become. But we're going to move on to Buddhism, because the reason I left Buddhism second is because Buddhism actually emerged from Hinduism. This is actually how Buddhism came to be. Now, Buddhism is another monist worldview, and according to Buddhist traditions, the Buddha his actual name was called Siddhartha Gautama. He's a Hindu, apparently he was a Hindu prince of the Shakya clan, and Gautama's father desired that his son would be a great king. And this would this was his hope, that he would be equal to or even greater than his own legacy. And so what the father tried to do was preserve the being and character of Gautama by keeping him away from all religion and trying to keep him away and distant from death, disease, old age, and other visible traits of the human condition. In other words, everything that is technically wrong with the world. So the father wanted to preserve him because he wanted to make it sure that he would be a great king that would follow afterwards. I'm not really sure what the reasoning was behind that. I don't quite see it, but that's what the story is nonetheless. And he would eventually marry his wife. Gautama would marry this wife named Yasodhara. And a son he would actually call Rahula. Now, his father was very strict with him, wouldn't let him to leave the palace. And Gautama was very insistent that he wanted to leave the palace. He wanted to see the outside world. He wanted to see the world for himself. And finally, his father agreed that he would allow him to leave and to look around. And what he did was, all right, I will allow you to go on this trip as long as I know where you're going. And so Gautama would tell him where he was intending to go. And what the father did then was send his troops ahead of him to purge that area that he was traveling to of any sickness, of any disease, of any death, of any old people, of any form of religion, so that what he would be seeing would be like a perfect environment. And once he did that, he then allowed Gautama to go. And so Gautama left and he went. And according to the Buddhist tradition, the Hindu gods saw what the father was doing and didn't believe this was right. And so they would manifest themselves as people. And so there would be a sick person, there would be an old person, there would be a monk that was passing into death, there would be people who were being tortured. And Gautama would be exposed to these things which had been supposedly purged. And he was so guilt-ridden upon seeing these things because of his lavish lifestyle and his royalty that he returned, and he couldn't really alleviate himself of this guilt. He recognized that there was this great suffering in the world, and that he himself wasn't really suffering until now. And according to the story, what he did was he spent various years. I'm just trying to remember what exactly it says here. Right. So what he did, he was still in the palace. But it came to the point where he couldn't deal with his guilt anymore, so he abandoned his wife and his child and his princely position and left altogether without telling anyone. He left at night. He didn't tell anyone. He left in the dark of night, and he went to a secret village, and there he spent various years trying to torture himself, self-mutilation. And he spent about 7 years doing that, thinking that he might alleviate his guilt, that he might find some form of atonement for his sin of living this lavish lifestyle and not having helped the poor. And a lot of questions can be raised here ethically. I mean, if Buddha came from a royal family, could not he have used his great wealth and his position to bring alleviation to the suffering? But no, this actually reflects quite a lot about the unbelieving thought and unbelieving nature of man. He's in fact quite selfish. He doesn't think about helping others. He just thinks about alleviating his guilt. So he leaves everything. And he tries to alleviate his guilt by self-mutilation, by being with the sick and being with the dying and trying to be at death's door. But he realized that none of this was really helping. And after 7 years, he went under a fig tree, just kind of gave up, and he just meditated there. And that's where, according to Buddhist tradition, he achieved enlightenment. He became the awakened one. And he would since then teach others for decades. I'll explain exactly what I mean by enlightenment and what he was teaching. But he would then become this great teacher. He was still a Hindu prince. And eventually what he taught became known as Buddhism and became a whole different worldview altogether, a whole different religion altogether. Now, the way he died was that he was always eating. People were always offering him food because they highly respected him. According to the tradition, someone offered him spoiled pork. He ate that, and he died. So, what a way to leave this world. So, he died and supposedly escaped reincarnation and was united with Nirvana. Now, Nirvana is a bit different than Brahman, even though it emerged from Hinduism, because Brahman is this idea of an impersonal God, that all is God and God is all. But within Buddhism, Nirvana is considered as this nothingness. So all of reality is illusion, and there is just this great nothingness, and everything is essentially nothing. It's difficult to understand. And as you probably notice as we go through Buddhism, it's been even said by even Ravi Zacharias himself that you would need several PhDs in order to have a comprehensive intellectual understanding of Buddhism and how it operates, because it is essentially irrational. It is very difficult to understand. And I guess just to mention in the midst of that, when ever speaking to someone who happens to espouse Buddhist worldviews, it's actually recommended to keep the conversation as simple as possible and not go into too much detail into every little doctrine or belief or just the way that the world works with them from their own worldview, just because it's very confusing. Now, according to the Buddhist teachings, this is what he taught, this is what Buddhism believes, the world is impermanent. In other words, it's all an illusion and it's in a constant state of flux. Oh, this is very similar to atheism, isn't it? A universe that is chance-oriented. Well, this is because this is the Eastern version of atheism. So if you go to the East and you want to see atheism, you see a Buddhist. So what we see is that everything is in a constant state of flux. Everything is an illusion. Secondly, Buddha taught that no human being can hold on to something, even if that something was permanent. It's all an illusion. Hence why Buddha taught anatman, or what would be considered the non-self. So why then is there suffering in human life? Because we who do not exist, this is what he struggled with, why was there suffering? Because we who do not exist cling to something that is temporal. So he's saying we don't actually exist, but we behave and live as if we do exist. I know it's very confusing. And we suffer because we desire for something that does not actually exist. That's what he's saying. And so he's saying we can never be free from this suffering until we internalize these truths and we recognize the temporality of reality and the non-existence of the self. And this prepares us to escape from the cycle of reincarnation and to join nirvana, nothingness, which cannot actually be explained because, according to Buddhists, it transcends all human language. Which again begs the question, how do you even know what you claim to know if it cannot be explained in human language? Now, how is this accomplished? Or how is this laid out? The Buddhist lays out the following, that Buddha taught 4 noble truths. And it's one, the first noble truth is that to live is to suffer. The second noble truth is that suffering is caused by attachment. The third is by eliminating suffering, one must eliminate attachment. And fourth, one can eliminate attachment by following the Eightfold Path. Now, what is the Eightfold Path? Or just to summarize the 4 noble truths, as some of you are writing this down. 1, to live is to suffer. 2, suffering is caused by attachment. 3, by eliminating suffering, one must eliminate attachment. And 4, one can eliminate attachment by following the Eightfold Path. Now, what is the Eightfold Path? The Eightfold Path consists of this. Having the right view or the right understanding of reality. That's number 1. Number 2 is to have the right intention or willing to achieve enlightenment, willing to leave everything behind. Thirdly, there is right speech, to say what is required. Fourthly, right action, doing what is required. Fifth, right livelihood, which would be monkship, to be a monk. Well, I'll go into that later. 6th, right effort, which is energy concentration. 7th, right mindfulness or meditation. And 8th, right concentration or focus. Now, if you'd like to write this down, I can give you my notes, or I can mention this to you afterwards, and you can write this down in the notebooks, no problem. You don't really need to know all of these things. But just to mention, I guess, a proper deconstruction of this, it's interesting that Buddha was essentially saying that you must eliminate all suffering. You have to, if you want to escape suffering, if you don't want to suffer, because to live is to suffer, if you want to eliminate all suffering from your own human experience, what you must do is that you must essentially let go of any attachments. And this means that you must not desire anything. You cannot have any desires. You cannot desire for love. You cannot desire for food. You cannot desire for anything whatsoever. And that is essentially what he means by attachment. We can't be attached to anything. But I would say a contradiction there for a Buddhist, or just the Buddhist worldview, is not adopting this religious worldview, is not adopting the Four Noble Truths and trying to live by these the Eightfold Path, is not considered a form of attachment. Are you not desiring to be free of suffering? Is that not itself a desire that should be altogether removed? Is following this Eightfold Path, or this sense of this task of to-do things, not considered a form of attachment? Should we not just eliminate that attachment altogether, that desire to achieve enlightenment? Does that not then hijack the Buddhist worldview? Now, there are two main branches to Buddhism. There's the Theravada and the Mahayana. And who is the Theravada where we, I'm trying to remember the name. I forgot the name escapes me right now, but the Dalai Lama essentially comes from this tradition. I forgot his actual name, but he comes from Theravada, this branch of Buddhism. And it's a religion particularly for monks called bhikkhus. You don't have to write that down, you can say monks. This is a religion particularly for monks, and these are supposedly the only ones who can attain nirvana. And these monks must follow the 10 precepts, which is they cannot take any life, they are not to steal, they are not to commit sexual immorality, they are not to lie, they are not to take intoxicating drinks, not to eat in excess or after the noon period. They cannot attain any or have any entertainment, which is dancing, singing, or drama, or even watching a movie. They can't decorate themselves or use cosmetics, and they cannot sleep in high or wide beds. They have to sleep on the floor. And they cannot touch any gold or silver. And the monk must be fully aware of all they do, how they breathe, how they eat, how they walk, etc. And they are to recognize that everything is temporary and will share the same fate as the body, that it will be destroyed. So the goal is to emulate the life of the first Buddha, of Siddhartha Gautama, to achieve enlightenment, while demonstrating compassion for all supposed life forms. Now, of course, the problem with Theravada Buddhism is that only monks can achieve enlightenment. They're the only ones that are qualified, not lay people or persons that aren't in the monkship. And this is what led to the second development of Mahayana Buddhism. Now, prior to moving to that next section, I will essentially say that it's interesting that they have this standard, or they have this list of to-dos, to-dos and not to-dos. They don't exactly refer to it as a moral code, but we could identify this as a moral code. They have this moral standard, which they cannot actually make sense of because all things are an illusion. So it's interesting how everything's an illusion, and yet everything in this universe, which is in a state of flux, which means it's always changing, you cannot have moral laws, or you cannot have laws of any sort, or standards of any sort in a universe that's always changing. And yet this illusion places these standards upon these monks in order to escape reincarnation. And so this is just various inconsistencies and contradictions of this Eastern religion. Now, the Mahayana Buddhism is the second branch, and this is for the lay people, the common people. And the Theravada can only be best occupied, how would I explain it? So the Theravada, which is the first branch, was supported by the lay people. They would help in terms of maintaining the temples. They would help by feeding the monks, but they couldn't actually participate. And so what led to a movement, you could say, of common Buddhism was the Mahayanas. And so the Mahayana was developed as a broader path of salvation from reincarnation for those who not become monks. And essentially it teaches that the world does not exist, the self does not exist, and that all things are an illusion, even though it appears to be real to our mind. And essentially it taught that any human being can become a bodhisattva, which means a Buddha in the making. Now, this essentially conveys the idea that we all have a spark of divine again. This is where it borrows from Hinduism, and it's again part of the onist worship, and it's a form of humanism. And we can, apparently a human being can become a Buddha in the making and produce, and this essentially ended up producing additional literature for the Buddhists, such as the Lotus Sutra and the Heart Sutra, in addition to what was already their sacred text, which was considered the Tripitaka, which I don't really need to go into because I've summarized essentially all of Buddhist teaching so far. Now, there's a lot more which I'm not going to go into, but I am going to touch on the cultural components of Buddhism, because it's actually been a very recent development in Mahayana Buddhism, as of recent as the 1980s until present, where in Taiwan, a particular branch of this Buddhism began to teach that Buddhist teachings have to reach every corner of the world. They have to propagate, they have to be missionaries now, Buddhist missionaries, and reach the entire world with this Mahayana Buddhism so that all people can try to be Buddhas and become free from this illusion and free from reincarnation. And what this involves is, in fact, the construction of massive temples, sponsoring educational institutions, hospitals, colleges, medical schools, etc., and even speaking to contemporary issues. Principally, it's concerned with bringing the Pure Land to earth. And what is this Pure Land? It's like the eschatological final days hope of the Buddhists. They believe that in the end, when history is done and time comes to a close, there will be an earth, a new earth. And this will be a utopia, an ideal society of perfection where there is no more suffering. Interesting. I wonder where they got that from. And what they've done is they've taken this humanistic utopia where man is essentially living according to his own terms, and they've dressed it in Buddhistic clothing and language. And this is a very recent development. And it's now what we're seeing is a lot of these ideas are being imported to the West, and so it doesn't necessarily have to be recognized as, oh, this is Mahayana Buddhism. My friend happens to be a Mahayana Buddhist. No, they don't have to be Mahayana Buddhists. They just have to believe a lot of the things which Buddhists happen to teach. So this is what they see. In other words, you could say that their mission is to spread the world with this lie, to spread the world, to spread this message to all people of the world with a onist, pagan, creation-worshipping religion. That's Buddhism. And Sikhism, it looks like I'm running out of time here, so I'll only be able to mention something very brief about Sikhism. And the reason I mentioned Sikhism as well, or I wanted to go into it, was because it's also pantheistic. In fact, Sikhism is a combination of Hinduism and Islam. Now that might seem a very odd combination, but this is because this actually originated from a poet named Kabir, and this is about the 16th century. No, yeah, 15th century, 16th century, and his father was a Muslim, and his mother was a Hindu. And this poet essentially taught, learning from the both of them, the oneness of God, which came from Islam. And he believed that there were no such things as distinctions between religions, that they all led to the same one God. And this principle is exactly what's been adopted by Western culture in terms of its pluralism, and not in terms of its structural pluralism, because we are able to have various different religious groups in our Western culture, but in terms of the pluralism we see today is not just in terms of structure, but in terms of direction, that we can worship all sorts of religions, that they're all equally valid. And so Sikhism has contributed that to Western culture in terms of its drift and its departure from its past Christian history. So this poet was very highly revered, and especially by the lower caste system of the Hindus, because he taught that everyone was equal. And his wisdom is believed to have influenced the founding of Sikhism, because his writings are referred to in the Sikh holy book called the Granth, Granth. And this actually is considered the 11th Guru. Now let me explain. There was once one Guru, and this Guru essentially ended up passing on the baton to 10 Gurus, and then the 10th Guru was the final Guru, and what happened was, essentially what was left was the teachings of the gurus, and the teachings of the guru being a book became the 11th guru. And this book is supposedly living, and Sikhs actually worship it. So in a Sikh temple, they would worship this book as it were a living entity. It's an impersonal God, but it's part of this impersonal God of all reality, that one is all and all is one. So this first guru is named Nanak, and he founded the Sikh religion in about the 16th century. And he was born to a Hindu father and a Muslim mother. And as the eldest, he carried ritualistic duties. But he didn't follow Hinduism, and instead came to believe that God transcended all religions. In other words, no one religion could possibly monopolize the truth of God. Now, he supposedly received the revelation of God and was called to be a guru, and which was meant to say he was a spiritual teacher of high standing, but also meant that he was the embodiment of God who teaches with divine infallibility. So to be a guru is to teach with divine infallibility. And he was known to perform Hindu worship and Islamic worship, which is certainly a contradiction. And he would criticize any of those who appear to be hypocrites to the beliefs of their faith. Now, Nanak taught that there is only one God, and he should be referred to as Satnam, meaning true God. And hence he said that people such as Jesus, or gods such as Jesus, Allah, and all other deities are absorbed into this one true God. And it should be added that this is not a personal God, but rather an impersonal God that inhabits all of reality. Again, akin, very similar to the pantheism of Hinduism, in which all is God and God is all. And he still held to the Hindu doctrines of reincarnation and karma, and advocated the pursuit to escape from this reincarnation. Now, his death is remembered in a funeral dispute in which, because he was loved by both Muslims and Hindus, Hindus wanted to cremate his corpse, while the Muslims wanted to bury him. Now, they left flowers on his body, and they said that if the flowers of the Hindus were fresher, then they could dispose of the body by cremating him. And if the flowers were fresher on the Muslim side, then they could bury him. Well, the tradition says that they came the next morning, the corpse had vanished. And what was left were the flowers of the Hindus and the Muslims, and they were both fresh. So what did they do? It's kind of funny. The Hindus took their flowers and they cremated them, and the Muslims buried their flowers. And that was their way of doing a funeral for the first guru. Now, Sikhism has certainly developed over the years. It's been certainly recognized as an ethnic religion, but it's very, very influential in terms of its oneness pluralist view. And it essentially falls into the same era as Hinduism and Buddhism in that everything is one. It's part of this pure oneness, and therefore there are no distinctions. And so, technically, there can be no such thing as diversity. There can be no such thing as pluralism, because you have to have diversity if you are to be a pluralist. Because everything is part of this oneness, there is no such pluralism. There is uniformity. And so it falls into this same problem. So I've tried my best to try to summarize the Eastern religions, and even though it may not be likely that you'll meet a very committed Hindu or a very committed Buddhist or a very committed Sikh, well, maybe Sikhs you might, in our everyday life, you will nonetheless see a lot of their teachings being imported into various mediums in our culture. And it's important to be able to highlight, it's important to be able to discern this, because most of the unbelievers that you're going to come in contact with are also importing these beliefs and forming what would you call a cocktail of a worldview or a Frankenstein-like worldview, where they've taken all these elements together, and that just makes it all the more easier for us to deconstruct the unbelieving worldview and to explain and try to pressure them to understand that really their oneness worldview cannot make sense, cannot justify the intelligibility of human experience, and then be able to present the gospel of Christ Jesus and how the true worldview, the biblical worldview, is the only worldview that can make sense of the intelligibility of human experience altogether. Time is up. We have 15 minutes for questions.